I never anticipated that a simple family barbecue would escalate into my Homeowners Association president, Eleanor Thompson, banning my entire family from visiting me. But when they tangled with a federal judge's son, they never imagined he'd wield his legal might to banish them from the entire county. What would you do if someone tried to sever your family ties? The aroma of sizzling burgers filled my backyard, the air punctuated by my sister, Sarah's, delighted shrieks as she chased her giggling kids through the oscillating sprinkler. After 6 long months of separation, this weekend visit was a lifeline. I'd only moved to the seemingly idyllic Willow Creek Estates 3 months prior, lured by its picturesque parks and impeccably manicured streets. Nobody, however, had warned me about the iron-fisted reign of Eleanor Thompson. "Excuse me, what exactly is transpiring here?" A sharp, brittle voice sliced through our laughter. I turned, spatula in hand, to confront a woman in her 50s, her blonde hair sculpted into a helmet of perfection. Her floral blouse was buttoned primly to her neck, despite the sweltering summer heat, and she clutched a clipboard like a weapon. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. "Just having a family barbecue," I replied, forcing a casual tone. "I'm Jack Davis, just moved in. Can I help you?" Her eyes, like chips of ice, narrowed as she meticulously counted Sarah's children. "Are these individuals registered guests?" Sarah stared at me, confusion clouding her features. I felt equally bewildered. "Registered? They're my family, visiting for the weekend." Eleanor's posture stiffened, her spine ramrod straight. "I am Eleanor Thompson, president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. According to our bylaws, all visitors must be registered with the HOA office 72 hours prior to arrival." I let out a disbelieving laugh, certain she was joking. The kids, sensing the shift in atmosphere, stopped playing, their small faces etched with worry. "That can't be right. Nobody mentioned anything about registering family when I purchased the house." "It's in the covenant you signed, Mr. Davis. Page 47, Bylaw 312, she stated, her voice dripping with condescending authority. She pointed towards Sarah's minivan, parked in my driveway. "Unregistered visitors, noise disturbance, and that vehicle is improperly parked." My sister, bless her heart, stepped forward, her protective maternal instincts flaring. "The kids are just playing. They're not being excessively loud." Eleanor, she utterly ignored her. "As HOA president, I am obligated to enforce our community standards. Consider this your first formal warning," she declared, scribbling something ominously on her clipboard. 3 warnings result in fines." My jaw clenched. I carefully placed the spatula on the grill. "Look, I was genuinely unaware of this rule. Now that I know, I'll register them first thing Monday morning." "That's not how it works, I am afraid. They need to leave immediately and return after proper registration," Eleanor retorted, a tight, smug smile playing on her lips. "Rules maintain our property values, Mr. Davis." My father, who had been observing the unfolding drama from the patio, his expression unreadable, finally stood. At 65, Judge William Carter still commanded respect without even raising his voice. "Eleanor, is it?" he began, his tone deceptively mild. "I'm Jack's father. Are you suggesting my grandchildren can't visit their uncle without submitting paperwork?" Eleanor's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. "And you are?" "William Carter, Federal Judge, Eastern District," my father replied, his gaze unwavering. I watched Eleanor's internal calculations flicker across her face. She straightened her blouse, a subtle adjustment. "Even judges are required to adhere to HOA regulations, sir. The rules apply to everyone equally." Dad nodded thoughtfully. "A fascinating interpretation. I'd be most interested to see the legal precedent supporting an HOA's authority to restrict family visitation rights on private property." Eleanor flushed, a mottled red, creeping up her neck. The covenant is a binding contract, Judge Carter. Your son agreed to these terms. Did the terms explicitly state that family members require pre-approval? Dad inquired, his voice still deceptively gentle. It states all visitors, she snapped. Now I'll overlook this violation just this once, she conceded, her tone suggesting immense generosity. But please ensure all future guests are properly registered. As she marched away, her back stiff with self-importance, Dad sat back down, a thoughtful frown creasing his forehead. Interesting woman, he remarked, his voice low. Sorry about that, I mumbled to Sarah, feeling a wave of embarrassment. Neighborhood politics, I guess. Does she always patrol people's backyards? Sarah asked, her brow furrowed. First time I've seen her, I replied, trying to sound reassuring. Probably nothing to worry about. We resumed our barbecue, but the easygoing atmosphere had evaporated. A sense of unease lingered, like a storm cloud on the horizon. My nephew, Michael, only 7, asked with wide, anxious eyes if they were going to be kicked out of my house. Of course not, buddy, I assured him, ruffling his hair. That lady is just very serious about rules. Later that evening, after the kids were tucked into bed, Dad and I sat on the patio, nursing beers. The crickets chirped, a stark contrast to the tension simmering beneath the surface. That HOA president, Dad said quietly, breaking the silence. She reminds me of cases I've presided over. What kind of cases? I asked, intrigued. People who confuse authority with power, he replied, taking a slow sip of his beer. I'd strongly suggest reading your HOA covenant very carefully, son. I shrugged, trying to dismiss his concern. It's probably nothing, just an overzealous board member. Maybe, Dad said, his voice laced with doubt. But in my experience, people who monitor children playing in backyards rarely stop there. Little did I know how profoundly right he was. I couldn't have foreseen that Eleanor Thompson had surveillance cameras installed at all neighborhood entrances, or that she was already firing off emails to other board members, complaining about my problematic attitude regarding community standards. Sarah's family departed Sunday afternoon. On Monday morning, I discovered a formal written warning affixed to my door, citing 3 violations from the weekend barbecue. Beside it, a brightly colored flyer announced the neighborhood's 4th of July celebration, featuring Eleanor Thompson as Grand Marshal. I had no inkling then that this was merely the opening salvo in a war, or that my quiet, unassuming father was already meticulously formulating a plan to handle the escalating conflict. Happy birthday to you. Mum's slightly off-key singing filled my kitchen as she carried in a homemade chocolate cake ablaze with candles. Dad followed close behind, a neatly wrapped gift box tucked under his arm. Their surprise visit for my 35th birthday was a much-needed balm after a brutally stressful week at work. You guys didn't have to drive 3 hours, I exclaimed, genuinely touched by their gesture. Nonsense, Mum replied, setting down the cake with a flourish. We'd never miss your birthday. We migrated to the front porch, sipping iced tea and enjoying the pleasantly cool evening. Dad inquired about work, and I shared the news of my recent promotion. Everything felt blissfully normal until I noticed a black SUV slowly cruising past my house. It circled the block twice. Someone looking for an address? Mum wondered, her brow furrowed. The SUV abruptly parked across the street. Eleanor Thompson emerged, accompanied by a balding man in a golf shirt and a thin woman with severe glasses. They marched towards my house with the grim determination of soldiers on a mission. "James Davis," Eleanor called out, her voice sharp and accusatory before even reaching my walkway. "Those individuals on your porch need to be identified immediately." My stomach plummeted. "These are my parents, Eleanor," I explained, fighting to keep my voice level. "They surprised me for my birthday." The balding man pulled out a tablet, his expression smug. No visitor registration on file. That's violation number 2, Davis. I'm Martin Greenberg, HOA Vice President, he added, with obvious self-satisfaction. And this is Diane Perkins, our secretary. Eleanor, without invitation, stepped onto my first porch step, invading my personal space. Unregistered guests are strictly prohibited. We take community security very seriously. My mother looked utterly bewildered. Security? We're just visiting our son. Ma'am, without proper registration, we have no way of knowing that, Diane said, adjusting her glasses with a nervous twitch. You could be anyone. Dad stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. I believe we met briefly last month. William Carter, James's father. Eleanor's lips formed a tight, unforgiving line. Yes, the judge. Even more reason for you to respect our regulations. Legal professionals should understand the importance of following rules. Legal professionals also understand the concept of reasonable restrictions, Dad replied calmly, and unreasonable ones. Martin stepped forward, his chest puffed out with self-importance. We're issuing a $500 fine for this violation, effective immediately, he announced, handing me a pink slip. Payment due within 10 days. I nearly choked. $500 because my parents visited without paperwork? The first violation was a warning, Eleanor explained, her voice dripping with artificial patience. Second violations carry monetary penalties, as clearly stated in Section 7 of your covenant. This is absolutely ridiculous, I exclaimed, my anger rising. They're my parents, celebrating my birthday. Rules apply equally to everyone, Diane interjected, her voice a high-pitched whine. Or they mean nothing. Dad gently touched my arm, a silent signal to calm down. James, may I see the exact bylaw they're referencing? Eleanor's smile never reached her eyes. Perhaps you should review the covenant you signed, Judge Carter. This isn't your courtroom. We operate under rules our community agreed upon. Martin, with unnecessary flourish, took photos of my parents' car with his phone, for documentation purposes. Is that really necessary? Mum asked, her voice trembling slightly. Completely, Eleanor replied, her tone chilling. We document all violations with photographic evidence. They departed after delivering the fine, walking in perfect, synchronized formation back to their SUV. I noticed neighbors peering from behind curtains, some quickly disappearing when I glanced their way. The sense of unease that had been simmering now boiled over into full-blown anxiety. I'm so sorry about this, I told my parents, feeling a wave of shame and frustration. I had no idea they'd be this extreme. Dad carefully examined the violation notice, his brow furrowed in concentration. $500 is excessive for a simple visitation issue. Have you read the full covenant? I admitted I hadn't. Like most people, I'd skimmed the massive document before signing, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of legalese. You've got a problem here, son, Dad said, his voice grim. This kind of behavior rarely improves without intervention. Mum looked worried. Will we need to register every time we visit you? Absolutely not, I declared firmly. This is getting completely out of hand. That night, after cake and presents, sleep eluded me. I unearthed my copy of the HOA covenant and began to read, my frustration growing with each page. The visitor registration policy did exist, but the wording specifically addressed extended stays and guests utilizing community amenities, nothing about brief family visits. The next morning, I walked over to my neighbor, Sam's house. He'd lived in Willow Creek for 5 years. Has the HOA always been this strict about visitors? I asked, my voice low. Sam glanced around nervously before answering, his body language radiating unease. It got significantly worse when Eleanor became president last year. Before that, the rules existed, but nobody enforced them with this level of zeal. Has anyone ever challenged her? I pressed. The Ramirez family tried, Sam whispered, when they were fined for having their grandparents stay during Christmas. They ended up with their garbage uncollected for 3 weeks due to route confusion. Then, their landscaping violation notices started arriving weekly. They moved out shortly after. That afternoon, I found a note in my mailbox. Board meeting, Tuesday, 7 p.m. Your attendance requested. It wasn't signed, but I recognized Eleanor's distinctive handwriting from the violation notice. When I called Dad to relay the information, he was oddly quiet. "What are you thinking?" I asked, a sense of foreboding creeping in. "I'm thinking it's time we looked into exactly what powers your HOA actually possesses under county law," he replied, his voice shifting into what Mum called his courtroom tone, and more importantly, what powers they don't have. After we hung up, I noticed an email notification. The HOA had copied me on a message to all residents, announcing new security measures, including visitor background checks and mandatory identification cards for all guests using community facilities. The first line mentioned recent security concerns stemming from unauthorized visitors. As I stared at my screen, another email arrived. This one from an anonymous address. "Don't fight them. They always win." Then, my phone pinged with a text from an unknown number. "Tuesday's meeting isn't optional if you want to stay in good standing." I glanced out my window at the perfectly manicured lawns and identical mailboxes. For the first time, Willow Creek Estates didn't feel like a dream neighborhood. It felt like a meticulously crafted trap. My phone blared at 5:30 a.m. It was my sister, Katie, her voice shaking with a mixture of panic and pain. "Jack, my water broke. The baby's coming 6 weeks early." I bolted out of bed, my heart pounding. "Stay calm, Katie. I'm coming to get you right now." Katie and her husband, Tom, were staying at my house because their own home was undergoing extensive renovations. The doctor had assured them the baby wouldn't arrive until next month. This was a complete, terrifying surprise. I raced to their room and helped Katie, her face contorted in pain as another contraction ripped through her, to my car. Tom, his eyes wide with worry, gathered their meticulously packed hospital bag. "Breathe, Katie, breathe," I said, squeezing her hand, my voice as reassuring as I could make it. "We'll be at the hospital in 15 minutes. As I backed out of my driveway, headlights suddenly blinded me. A black SUV, that accursed black SUV, blocked my exit. Eleanor Thompson emerged, followed by Martin and 2 other, equally grim-faced HOA board members. "Going somewhere with unregistered guests?" Eleanor inquired, her voice dripping with smug satisfaction, pointing at Katie, who was now moaning in the passenger seat. "My sister is in labor," I shouted, my voice raw with desperation. "Move your car, now!" Eleanor crossed her arms, her stance unyielding. "You should have considered emergency situations before repeatedly violating our rules." Tom ran up, his face pale with fear. "Please, our baby is coming early. We need to get to the hospital." Martin, predictably, pulled out his phone and began recording. "More violations to document," he muttered, his tone almost gleeful. I couldn't believe what was unfolding. It was surreal, like a nightmare playing out in slow motion. "Are you serious? This is a medical emergency." "Rules don't bend for emergencies," Eleanor stated, checking her watch with a deliberate theatrical gesture. "I'll need to see a doctor's note confirming this isn't just another attempt to circumvent our visitor policy." Katie screamed from the car. I saw a spreading stain of blood on her pants. Pure, unadulterated terror seized me. "Call an ambulance," I yelled to Tom, who thankfully already had his phone out. Eleanor's face twitched with a flicker of uncertainty, the first crack in her facade, but she didn't move her vehicle. Neighbors began appearing in their doorways, drawn by the commotion, their faces etched with a mixture of shock and disbelief. Mrs. Wilson, from across the street, hurried over in her bathrobe, her hair in disarray. "Eleanor, what on earth are you doing?" she demanded, her voice trembling with outrage. "That woman needs medical help." "Stay out of this, Doris," Eleanor snapped, her voice sharp and dismissive. "This is HOA business." 10 excruciating minutes, minutes that felt like an eternity, crawled by before the wail of sirens pierced the tense silence. The paramedics, forced to park on the street, had to wheel a gurney around Eleanor's SUV. They quickly assessed Katie and loaded her into the ambulance, their movements efficient and urgent. "I'm coming with you," Tom said, climbing in beside his wife, his face etched with worry. I turned to Eleanor, who was still unbelievably blocking my driveway. My hands were shaking with a rage so intense it was almost paralyzing. "Move your car now." "The board has voted," Eleanor announced loudly, her voice carrying to the gathering crowd of stunned neighbors. "Due to your repeated violations, all unregistered guests are banned from Willow Creek Estates. Your family is no longer welcome here." The neighbors gasped, a collective intake of breath. "You can't ban someone's family from visiting," Mrs. Wilson protested, her voice rising in indignation. "Actually, we can," Martin interjected, holding up his tablet with a triumphant smirk. "Section 47.3 grants the board emergency powers to protect community standards." I needed to get to the hospital, not engage in a futile argument with these power-crazed maniacs. "My father will hear about this," I growled, my voice low and threatening. Eleanor smirked. "Oh yes, the judge. Tell him his title means nothing here. We have our own laws." Finally, she moved her SUV. I sped to the hospital, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white, my mind a whirlwind of fury and fear. Katie delivered a tiny but thankfully healthy baby girl an hour later. While she rested, I called my father, the words tumbling out in a torrent of outrage. "Dad, you won't believe what just happened." I explained everything. The blocked driveway, Eleanor's callous indifference, the near disaster. The phone went silent for so long, I thought we'd been disconnected. "Dad, are you there?" "I'm here," he replied, his voice eerily calm, devoid of any emotion. "Text me Eleanor and Martin's full names and addresses." "What are you going to do?" I asked, a flicker of apprehension mixing with my anger. "Nothing illegal," he said, his voice still chillingly calm. "But no one threatens my family or endangers my new granddaughter." That evening, while Katie and the baby slept, my father arrived at the hospital. He didn't look like the relaxed man who'd flipped burgers at our barbecue. This was Judge William Carter, the man who had sentenced hardened criminals and faced down corrupt politicians without flinching. "I've made some calls," he said quietly, his eyes gleaming with steely determination. "The county records office has some interesting information about Willow Creek Estates." "What kind of information?" Tom asked, his voice laced with cautious hope. Dad pulled out his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Their HOA was incorporated improperly. Half their bylaws were never properly filed with the county, and Eleanor Thompson has been signing official documents using a title she's not legally entitled to. "Can that help us?" I asked, my heart beginning to beat with a renewed sense of hope. "It's just the beginning," Dad said, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I've also discovered that Martin Greenberg's landscaping company has an exclusive contract with the HOA. A rather convenient coincidence, considering he's on the board that approves those contracts." A plan was forming, taking shape in the sterile confines of the hospital waiting room. I could tell. Dad had that focused, intense look he got before delivering a major ruling. "Jack, I need you to do something," he said, turning to me. "When you get home, check your mailbox. There should be a letter regarding your property taxes." "Why does that matter?" I asked, bewildered. "Because," Dad said, with a slight knowing smile, "your property taxes fund the county government. which has jurisdiction over HOAs, and I happen to know someone who chairs the County Oversight Committee. As we talked, my phone pinged with a barrage of text messages. Neighbors were sending pictures of Eleanor and Martin placing bright orange traffic cones at the entrance to our subdivision, accompanied by a hastily scrawled sign, "Visitor checkpoint, all guests must present HOA approval." "They've completely lost their minds," I muttered, showing Dad the pictures. He nodded gravely. "What they're doing isn't just mean-spirited. Some of it is actually illegal." When visiting hours ended, Dad insisted on driving me home. As we approached Willow Creek Estates, we saw the makeshift checkpoint. Martin sat in a folding chair, meticulously checking IDs against a clipboard. "Your father can enter," Martin said when I rolled down my window, his tone condescending. "But he needs to register for future visits. New policy." Dad leaned across me, his voice cutting through the night air. "Under whose authority are you restricting access to a public road?" Martin puffed up his chest, his voice laced with arrogance. "The HOA board's authority." "Interesting," Dad said mildly, "because according to county records, this entrance road is public property, maintained by county tax dollars." Martin's smug smile faltered. "That's not check your facts." "I already have," Dad interrupted, his voice sharp and decisive. We drove through without another word, but I knew this battle was far from over. It was merely entering a new, more dangerous phase. In my mailbox, just as Dad predicted, was a letter about property taxes. But there was something else. A certified letter from the HOA. I tore it open, my blood pressure spiking as I read the contents. They were fining me $500 for a pattern of visitor violations and threatening lien proceedings if I didn't pay within 30 days. I relayed the contents to Dad, my voice tight with fury. He took the letter, read it carefully, and folded it neatly. "Perfect," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. "This is exactly what we needed." "How is this good news?" I asked, completely baffled. Dad placed a hand on my shoulder, his expression serious. "Because they've put their illegal actions in writing, son, and that's exactly what a judge likes to see." I awoke to the jarring sound of car doors slamming outside my house. Peeking cautiously through the blinds, I spotted 3 official-looking vehicles, bearing county government seals, parked in front of the HOA Community Center, directly across the street. Men and women in crisp business attire carried boxes and briefcases inside, their movements purposeful and efficient. My phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Wilson. "Something big happening at HOA office. Eleanor looks furious." I threw on clothes and hurried outside. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, watching as county officials entered the building. Eleanor stood at the door, her face a mask of fury, arguing with a tall woman in a gray suit, her voice shrill and demanding. "You can't just barge in here, demanding documents," Eleanor shouted, her voice echoing across the street. "This is private property." "Actually, Ms. Thompson," the woman replied, holding up a sheaf of papers, her voice calm and authoritative, "this is a legal inspection under County Code 43.7. We have the authority to review all financial and operational records." Martin rushed up, still in his bathrobe, his hair disheveled, his face a picture of panicked confusion. "What's going on?" "The County Oversight Committee is conducting a surprise audit," someone whispered, the words spreading through the crowd like wildfire. I felt a tap on my shoulder. It was my father, looking surprisingly well-rested for someone who'd been at the hospital until late last night. "Morning, son," he said casually. "Lovely day, isn't it?" I stared at him, my suspicion growing. "Did you do this?" His expression remained neutral, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. "Let's just say I made a phone call to an old friend expressing some concerns. Judge Martinez chairs the County HOA Oversight Committee. I didn't even know there was such a committee, I muttered, still slightly stunned. Most people don't, Dad said, his voice low. That's how certain HOAs get away with overstepping their authority. Eleanor spotted us watching and stormed over, her finger jabbing accusingly at my father. You? This is your doing, isn't it? Well, you'll find nothing wrong with our records. Dad smiled pleasantly. Then you have nothing to worry about, Miss Thompson. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, her face contorted with rage. 20 years! I've run this community for 20 years without interference. We maintain property values. We keep out undesirables. We exclude family members from visiting their loved ones. Dad interrupted, his voice sharp and clear. Create arbitrary rules without the proper legal foundation. Our attorneys will fight this, she hissed, her voice trembling. I look forward to seeing them in court, Dad replied, his smile unwavering. Perhaps they can explain why your HOA has been operating with bylaws that were never properly filed with the county recorder. Eleanor's face went pale, the color draining from her cheeks. She retreated to the community center without another word, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Throughout the day, neighbors knocked on my door, seeking information, their faces filled with a mixture of hope and anxiety. Apparently, word had spread that my father was somehow behind the investigation. I explained what I could, without revealing details Dad had shared in confidence. By afternoon, wild rumors were circulating through Willow Creek Estates. Someone claimed the HOA had been charging inflated fees for years, pocketing the difference. Another neighbor heard that Martin's landscaping company had received hundreds of thousands of dollars for work that was never completed. At 3 p.m., my doorbell rang. I opened it to find a young woman with a press badge, her expression keen and alert. Jack Davis, I'm Taylor Hayes from the County Chronicle. I'm doing a story on HOA oversight. Would you care to comment on the investigation happening in your community? Before I could answer, my phone rang. It was Katie calling from the hospital, her voice choked with sobs. The baby's oxygen levels dropped, she said, her voice breaking. They've moved her to intensive care. Can you come? I'll be right there, I said, my heart sinking. I turned to the reporter, my voice strained. I'm sorry, family emergency. As I grabbed my keys, I spotted Eleanor and Martin huddled near my driveway, their faces grim, watching me. Going somewhere? Eleanor called out, her voice filled with mock concern. Purpose to see those unregistered family members? I was in no mood for their games. My newborn niece was fighting for her life. My niece is in intensive care. Do you really want to try and block me again? The ban remains in effect, Martin said smugly. Your family is not welcome here. Something inside me snapped. I marched up to them, my phone recording, my voice low and steady. Let me make this absolutely clear, I said, my anger a cold, hard knot in my chest. If you interfere with me visiting my family during a medical emergency again, I will personally ensure that every news outlet in this county knows your names and faces. Eleanor stepped back, startled by the intensity of my tone. Furthermore, I continued, the county investigators have already requested interviews with all board members. I suggest you prepare to explain why you're using HOA authority to conduct personal vendettas. I drove to the hospital, seething with anger, but focused on Katie and the baby. My father was already there, comforting Tom in the waiting room. They've stabilized her, Dad told me, his voice filled with relief. She's going to be okay. Relief washed over me, a wave of gratitude so intense it almost brought me to my knees. While Kate rested and Tom sat with the baby, Dad pulled me aside. The investigation is turning up more than we initially expected, he said quietly. The county found financial records hidden in a separate filing cabinet. Martin's landscaping company received triple the market rate for services, and Eleanor approved payments to a consulting firm owned by her sister. So they're stealing from us, I said, disgust churning in my stomach. It appears so, Dad confirmed. And there's more. They've been selectively enforcing rules based on personal preferences. Mrs. Wilson filed 3 complaints about harassment when she questioned fee increases, but the board dismissed them without investigation. By evening, we returned to Willow Creek Estates to find the community in an uproar. An emergency HOA meeting had been called for 7:00 p.m. Every homeowner had received notice, a stark contrast to previous meetings held during work hours when few could attend. The community center was packed. I grabbed a seat near the back, noting the county officials observing from a corner. Eleanor and the board members sat at a table, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Due to concerns raised by residents and county officials, Eleanor began stiffly. We're conducting this emergency meeting to address questions about HOA operations. A neighbor stood up immediately. Is it true you've been giving contracts to companies you personally benefit from? That allegation is under review, Eleanor responded, her voice tight, her jaw clenched. What about banning family members from visiting? Someone else called out. My grandkids aren't allowed to visit me anymore. Martin leaned into his microphone. The visitor policy protects all residents from what? Interrupted Mrs. Wilson, her voice trembling with righteous anger. From having loved ones nearby. That policy wasn't voted on by homeowners. The meeting descended into chaos, a cacophony of voices, as years of pent-up frustrations poured out. People shared stories of arbitrary fines, denied renovation requests, and intimidation tactics. I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned to see the county reporter, Taylor Hayes, sitting behind me. Quite a story unfolding here, she whispered. Care to comment now? Before I could answer, Eleanor's voice cut through the noise. This is all happening because of him, she shrieked, pointing directly at me. Jack Davis and his judge father are trying to destroy everything we've built. They're outsiders who don't understand our community values. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to me. I stood slowly, acutely aware that whatever I said next would be quoted in tomorrow's newspaper. I moved here because I loved this community, I began, my voice quiet but firm. All I wanted was for my family to visit occasionally, without being treated like criminals. People nodded in agreement, a murmur of support rippling through the room. But this isn't about visitor policies anymore, I continued, my voice gaining strength. It's about accountability. It's about whether a small group of people can create their own laws and enforce them however they please. Eleanor jumped up, her face contorted with rage. You have no proof of wrongdoing. This is character assassination. That's when the tall woman from the county stepped forward, her voice calm and authoritative. Actually, Ms. Thompson, we have substantial evidence of financial impropriety. This meeting is now adjourned, pending completion of our investigation. The county is temporarily freezing all HOA funds and suspending the board's authority. Gasps echoed through the room. Martin dropped his head into his hands, his shoulders shaking. As people filed out in stunned silence, my father appeared beside me. Tomorrow will be interesting, he said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. The county judge has agreed to hear an emergency motion regarding the visitor ban. Will it work? I asked, my voice filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Dad's expression was serious but hopeful. Eleanor and her board have been operating outside their legal authority for years. It's time someone called them to account. Eleanor and Martin cornered us at the exit, their faces contorted with rage. You've declared war on the wrong people, Eleanor hissed, her voice venomous. We have connections throughout this county. Dad regarded her calmly. So do I, Ms. Thompson. The difference is, mine are all within the law. As we walked to our cars, my phone pinged with a news alert. I opened it to find a headline that made my heart race. County launches criminal probe into Willow Creek, HOA board members face possible fraud charges. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since this ordeal began, I felt a surge of hope, a belief that justice might actually prevail. Rain lashed against the windows of the packed community center, the sound mirroring the storm raging inside. I squeezed through the crowd, spotting Eleanor whispering urgently to Martin in a corner. When my father walked in, the room went deathly silent. His grey hair was damp from the storm, but his eyes were clear and determined as he placed a thick folder on the table. "Who invited him?" Eleanor snapped, her voice shrill with panic. "This meeting is for residents only." My neighbor Rose stood up, her voice strong and clear. "I invited him. We all did," she said, looking around the room at the nodding faces. "We're tired of being bullied." Eleanor's face turned crimson. "This is completely against procedure. Martin, call security." Martin didn't move. He was staring at the folder my father had brought, his face pale and drawn. Dad stepped forward, his voice resonating with authority. "My name is Judge William Carter. My son lives here, and I'm deeply concerned about how this HOA is being run." "We don't care who you are," Eleanor cut in, her voice laced with desperation. "You have no authority here." "Actually," my father said, opening his folder, "I have copies of every HOA financial record for the past 5 years. Would you like to explain why $43,000 of community funds were transferred to Coastal Dynamics LLC last year?" Martin's coffee cup crashed to the floor, shattering into 1,000 pieces. Several people gasped. My father continued, his voice relentless. "A company that, interestingly, was incorporated by your husband, Mrs. Thompson." Eleanor's mouth opened and closed like a fish, gasping for air. That's confidential information. How did you get that?" "Public records," Dad replied simply, "just like the county property maps showing that the community landscaping project last summer was mainly done on board members' properties." An older gentleman stood up, his voice shaking with anger. "Is that why our request to fix the playground was denied? There wasn't enough money?" Dad nodded. "And that's just the beginning. I've uncovered at least 16 separate violations of state law in how this HOA operates." He turned to face the crowd directly. "But what truly disturbs me is the selective enforcement of rules. My son's family was banned from visiting, yet when board member Schmidt's extended family stayed for 3 weeks last summer, no action was taken." Several people shouted in agreement, a chorus of outrage filling the room. I spotted Mrs. Schmidt sinking lower in her chair, her face a mask of shame. "This stops now," my father declared, his voice ringing with conviction. "I've prepared formal complaints with both the county prosecutor and the state attorney general's office." Eleanor lunged for the folder, her movements desperate. "You have no right." 2 residents stepped between them, blocking her path. The room erupted into shouting, a chaotic cacophony of anger and frustration. "Order, order!" Martin banged a gavel frantically, his face dripping with sweat. Mrs. Patel, a neighbor I barely knew, stood up. "My husband is a CPA. He's been questioning the HOA finances for years, but was always ignored. Can I see those records?" Dad handed her a copy. "Page 37 is particularly interesting." Eleanor's face had gone from red to white, her composure completely shattered. "This meeting is adjourned," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "No, it's not," Rose said firmly. "According to our bylaws, we can call for an emergency vote to remove board members." "I so move." "Second," called voices from around the room, a resounding chorus of agreement. Eleanor grabbed her purse, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. "This is ridiculous. You'll all be hearing from our lawyer." As she stormed toward the exit, Dad called out, his voice calm and measured. "Mrs. Thompson, you might want to delay that call. The county fraud investigator would like to speak with you first. He's waiting outside." Eleanor froze at the door, Through the window, we could all see a woman in a dark suit standing next to a police car. "You set me up," she whispered, turning to face me, her eyes filled with a chilling mixture of hatred and despair. "This isn't justice. This is revenge." My father looked at her, his expression unwavering. "No, Mrs. Thompson. This is accountability." Martin suddenly pushed through the crowd toward me, his face contorted with rage. "You think you've won?" he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "I have friends in every real estate office in this county. You'll never sell your house, and your property values will crash when I'm done spreading rumors about this neighborhood." Before I could respond, someone's phone flashed. "Got that threat on video," said Mrs. Patel's teenage daughter, a triumphant smile spreading across her face. "Should I post it now, or wait?" The door opened, and the county investigators stepped in from the rain. "Eleanor Thompson and Martin Greenberg," she called, her voice clear and authoritative. "I'd like to ask you some questions about Willow Creek Estate's financial records." As they were led away, the remaining board members huddled together, their faces etched with panic. What had started as a simple fight over family visits had unraveled their entire power structure in a single, stormy night. But something told me this battle wasn't over yet, and the worst was still to come. "Breaking news from Willow Creek Estates," announced the TV reporter, standing in front of my house, the scene a flurry of activity. In a shocking development, 5 HOA board members are facing criminal charges following what began as a dispute over family visitation rights. I clicked off the TV as my doorbell rang. 3 weeks had passed since the explosive community meeting, and nothing had been the same since. "You've got visitors," said Officer Jenkins with a smile. The police had been driving through our neighborhood regularly since Eleanor and Martin were released on bail. Their conditions included staying 500 feet away from my property. My sister, Sarah, ran up the driveway, her kids in tow, their faces beaming. "No clipboard Nazis stopping us today," she laughed, hugging me tightly. "Come in," I said, glancing nervously at Eleanor's house across the street. The windows were dark, but I sometimes felt she was watching, a lurking presence, a shadow of the past. Inside, my neighbor Rose sat with my father, reviewing documents, their faces intense. "We found something huge," Rose said, barely containing her excitement. "Remember that community pool project that was cancelled 3 years ago? The HOA collected over $200,000 for it, which mysteriously disappeared. We traced it to an account in Bermuda," Dad added, spreading out bank statements, his finger pointing to a specific line. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Back off, or your house burns next." I showed it to Officer Jenkins, who immediately called it in. "That's the 4th threat this week," he said grimly. "We're taking this very seriously." "They're scared," Dad said, his voice low. "The county prosecutor is offering plea deals to board members who testify against Eleanor and Martin." A car screeched to a halt outside. Martin stormed up my walkway, ignoring the restraining order, his face contorted with rage. "You ruined everything," he shouted through the door, his voice raw with desperation. 15 years building this community, and you destroy it in a month." Officer Jenkins stepped outside. "Sir, you need to leave immediately. This neighborhood was perfect before they moved in," Martin yelled, pointing a trembling finger at me, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and despair. Mrs. Patel appeared from next door, her expression resolute. "Perfect? My family endured 3 years of random inspections after we put up Diwali decorations. Tell them about that perfection, Martin." Other neighbors emerged from their homes, forming a protective circle around my house, a wall of solidarity against Martin's outburst. "These people destroyed our property values," Martin cried desperately, his voice losing its force, his shoulders slumping. "Actually, Mr. Washington," from across the street, interjected calmly, "I just got an offer on my house $20,000 above asking. Turns out, people want to live in communities without corrupt HOAs. Martin's face crumpled, the fight draining out of him. He looked like a deflated balloon, his bravado replaced by a hollow emptiness. Police cruisers pulled up, their sirens silent, their presence a final definitive statement. They led him away. His head hung low, as neighbors quietly applauded. That evening, a hesitant knock came at my back door. I opened it to find Mrs. Schmidt, the former board secretary, standing on my porch, her face etched with nervousness. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered, glancing around furtively. "But you need to know, Eleanor kept files on everyone. She's planning something at tomorrow's court hearing. Blackmail, photographs, personal information. She has something on the judge assigned to your case." I called my father immediately, my heart pounding with a renewed sense of dread. He made some calls, his voice calm and efficient, and by morning, the judge had recused himself. The courthouse steps were swarming with reporters the next day. Eleanor appeared, dressed in an expensive suit, looking surprisingly confident, until she saw the new judge enter. A stern-faced woman my father had never met. A judge clearly immune to Eleanor's carefully cultivated influence. Inside, Eleanor's lawyer stood dramatically, his voice booming through the courtroom. "Your Honor, this entire case is a personal vendetta by Judge Carter against my client for simply enforcing community rules." The new judge peered over her glasses, her expression unimpressed. "I've reviewed the evidence. This appears to be a clear case of financial fraud, not a dispute over rules." Eleanor whispered frantically to her lawyer, who, clearly flustered, tried a different approach. "My client was merely following established practices set by previous boards." "A fascinating defense," the judge remarked dryly. "Essentially, others committed fraud before me, so my fraud should be excused." The courtroom erupted in laughter, a wave of sound that died abruptly when Eleanor suddenly stood, her voice trembling but resolute. "I want to change my plea," she announced, her voice echoing through the silent courtroom. Her lawyer looked shocked, his jaw dropping open. "I'll testify against everyone," Eleanor continued, her voice breaking, her carefully constructed facade crumbling before our eyes. "The developers, the county inspectors who took bribes, all of it, in exchange for immunity." The prosecutor leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "What developers?" And that's when the real bombshell dropped. Eleanor revealed a decade-long scheme involving kickbacks from developers, falsified inspection reports, and county officials on the take. Willow Creek Estates was just one of 17 communities affected, a small piece of a much larger, more insidious puzzle. 6 months later, I sat in my backyard, watching my nieces and nephews splash in our new community pool, funded by the recovered stolen money. The laughter of children, the scent of freshly cut grass, the feeling of peace. It was a world away from the tense, fear-filled atmosphere of a year ago. "You know, it's funny," Rose said, handing me a glass of lemonade, her voice thoughtful. "All Eleanor had to do was let your family visit, and none of this would have happened." Dad joined us, tossing the newspaper onto the table. The headline screamed, "Former HOA President sentenced to 7 years, County Commissioner resigns in disgrace." "Sometimes the smallest injustices reveal the biggest crimes," he said thoughtfully, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. My phone buzzed with a notification. I'd been elected president of our new, transparent HOA board. Our first order of business, updating the guest policy to read simply, "All families welcome anytime." As twilight fell over our liberated neighborhood, I realized that standing up against one small abuse of power had freed hundreds of homeowners from years of corruption. Eleanor had been right about one thing: rules are rules. But in America, the most important rule is that no one is above the law, not even the HOA. This story highlights the critical importance of vigilance and the courage to challenge abuses of power, even when they seem small or insignificant. It underscores that unchecked authority, even at the most local level, can lead to widespread corruption and injustice. The story also emphasizes the power of community and collective action in holding those in power accountable. Have you ever experienced a similar situation with an HOA or another governing body? Share your stories and thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more engaging stories and insightful discussions.